Hi, this is Tom Reesing. I'm with Applied Information Sciences, and we're here in the beautiful Hyatt Hill Country Resort in San Antonio with the SharePoint Connections Coast to Coast Tour.
Here with Tom Reesing, and we're visiting here while we're at the Coast to Coast conference. And Tom's world and mine collided 5 years ago, 6 years ago, a long time ago.
That, yeah.
Deploying 2007,
right?
RTM 2007.
That's right.
Like that. So just SharePoint people will know what that means. And my world very much has been in the architectural world and then down in more IT pro stuff, whereas while you've got a solid foundation in all of these things, being an MCM and all, your world is very focused in the dev-centric. You're somewhat more dev-centric.
That's absolutely true.
Complete competencies across it all, but dev-centric.
Right.
And we were talking a little earlier, and you're going to do a session here around tooling for developing in either 2007 and or 2010, coexisting, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So maybe just to start, maybe some folks are somewhat new to development.
Sure.
What tools existed in 2010? Let's compare contrast between 2007 and 2010.
Well, first, thanks, Jeff, for doing this. And I just wanted to say my concept behind it is simple, and I'm sure you come across it in the IT pro world as well, right? Very few people have the opportunity to work only with 2010 or only with 2007. I've talked to some people at the conference who are lucky to have only 2010, right? But we talk to people who've been involved with this for a long time, and you're bound to be involved with a project where either they've got some sites on 2007, some on 2010, or they're moving, or they're partway through the process and they need some help. 2007 didn't stand still, right? I mean, you talked about RTM. At RTM, boy, we had nothing.
We had nothing.
Right? We bought...
We had a text editor.
We were buying every book that came out.
Right.
That's when I think I got my Amazon Prime membership.
Right? I remember that.
And,
I was there.
Every time a new book came out, I ordered it. It had the Administrator's Companion, and then inside Windows SharePoint Services when that came out for development, and Todd Bleeker's book. But the TechNet, the tooling in Visual Studio, everything was just kind of hit or miss, right? It's like, does it work now? And new things were being released. Well, fast forward to today, right? And Microsoft's done a lot of work on the documentation and the tooling and what's available. And so that's
night and day.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, so certainly for 2010, right?
Yes.
And most people are talking about 2010 right now, and I want to focus on the future, right, with 2010. But I also want to be realistic. A lot of people are still working in 2007, right? So 2007 didn't stand still. There is great documentation available now, today, more than there was in the past. There's even better documentation for 2010. But that's some of the things I want to talk about. So the SharePoint development.
So let's then take, how did the 2007 development platform evolve from RTM to today? Because it still is evolving.
So one of the key components for developers for documentation is what are commonly called software development kits, right? So Microsoft generally releases these.
SDKs.
Right. They're available on MSDN, right, online, but they're also downloadable, and a lot of times they come with extras when you download. It's not just the documentation that you see on MSDN. You get that, too, in CHM format, in a help file format that you can take offline, right, if you don't have access, like we're having some connectivity issues right now, right? But you also get samples, and sometimes you get project templates too, right? So that's one of the things that changed between the very first release of the SDK. I think it was a 1.1 or 1.0 probably at RTM, and then the 1.3 version that it released in 2009, the most recent version of the SDK. They have new project templates in Visual Studio for workflows, for example.
Yeah, so all of that, the templates and all that stuff, just and the CHM, all available inside of the IDE that is Visual Studio.
Well, that's right. Yeah, well, the CHM kind of stands alone.
It does.
But it's referenceable, right? So, in Visual Studio, you have that F1 context, right? So you click on, SP site, an SP site object, you hit F1, and it pulls up the SDK But it's up to you to download it and update it, right? So
Yeah.
if you're sitting out there and you haven't gone out and downloaded the SDK for a while, or right, or you come into a new place, they just dump a VM on you, say this is the developer's VM, which I've experienced that. Right, you go out, you download the latest one,
Yeah.
right? Because that has updated help files, updated samples, example code,
Yes.
updated project templates, all that great stuff. So that's one of the big things.
And real quick though, how often does that get updated? So how often should a developer go out and look for new information?
Well, so for 2007, I don't expect there to be major changes to that going forward,
steady
right? But at the same time, in the 3 years they were developing it, there were a lot of changes, right? So the
Okay.
2010 stuff is going to be updated fairly
We're
frequently.
talking monthly, quarterly?
I would expect it's more on about every 6 months.
Okay.
I would be
All right.
expecting updates, but I don't know that they've released a. I haven't seen that
Okay.
projected.
So the
timeframe.
contract developer who's going from site to site working on stuff, first thing should be when you get your VM or your OS, go download.
Get the latest SDK,
Yeah.
right? Now the other thing, and there are similar pieces for 2010, is something they called Visual Studio extensions for Windows SharePoint services, right? So Windows SharePoint services, of course, now known as SharePoint Foundation in 2010, is the basis. And Microsoft released an early version of that, not at RTM, later from RTM, which had all of the SharePoint project templates
Yeah.
and item templates for Visual Studio, right? So when you go into Visual Studio, you say new project, no SharePoint, right? There's web, Windows Forms, right? There's no SharePoint until
Right.
you install Visual Studio extensions for Windows SharePoint services.
Yeah.
And then when you do that, you get all those project templates. We saw some of those at the last user group meeting.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah,
We did.
And those are all now included with SharePoint 2010 in Visual Studio 2010. But when you're working with SharePoint 2007, you're going to be working with Visual Studio 2008 most
Yep.
likely. We were working with Visual Studio 2005 back at RTM.
Back in the time.
And you don't have that until you've downloaded Visual Studio extensions. And those extensions themselves changed a lot over the course of the, after release of SharePoint 2007. So a lot of people, what I've found when I go out and talk to developers, they tried out the first release.
Okay.
And we all know how kind of first releases
of
go
anything,
sometimes, right?
not so great.
Unfortunately, that also set the precedent. People said, boy, that's just junk, right? It just doesn't work for me. And most people, when they get burned once, right, they don't go back, right?
Yeah.
So Visual Studio extensions had been updated a number of times. And in fact, it's got a funny release schedule because there, I think, were 3 releases of Visual Studio extensions 1.3.
Really?
And the most recent one is called 1.3, I believe it's April CTP. Right?
That sounds easy.
So there's 2 versions, there are at least 2 versions on MSDN right now. I think that you can download a Visual Studio extensions for Windows SharePoint Services 1.3.
Okay.
There's 2 versions. And you want the most recent one. That one has the most updates. And when you work with that, you can create for example, a SharePoint web part in Visual Studio 2008. And then when you go to Visual Studio 2010, they have another download you can get where you can import that SharePoint project into SharePoint 2010. And that's the most supported Microsoft migration strategy for SharePoint 2007.
So take the
code to
raw
2010.
project that you had in 08, bring it into Studio 10, recompile, redeploy.
Right.
Okay.
And
Make
so,
a WSP.
And so that's one of the things, I mean, from the IT Pro world that not only do you want like Service Pack 2, for example, which we know is almost in some ways a different product, right? There's extra stuff
so
in
much
there
there
that wasn't in RTM.
That's right. I mean, down at the command line level, I mean, all throughout the product. There's
And
so
things
much more.
that just work, too, right? But there's a lot of cool stuff in there for upgrading, too, right? Like prepare, what are my STS ADM commands, right?
It is.
But you got those, right? And then even that, after SP2, they continue to update that, right? The cumulative updates.
They continue.
Yes. So from a developer's perspective, you have to pay attention to that stuff, too.
Okay.
Right? Because in your development environment, you want to be using SP2 as well.
Yes.
Right? And probably the cumulative updates. But you also have to pay attention to this other stuff. Not a lot of people are talking about it, I don't think. But they really can help you get into that 2010
Get to
goal.
2010. So tooling different / better. I mean, more of the same. I don't know if I'll call it different, but more of the same and a better story.
Right.
It's not like the Studio 05 at also 7 release date. That was
Right.
bad. That was a bad story.
Yeah.
Story's very good now. If you're going from 07 to 2010, don't just take those web parts and bring them across. Let's get them recompiled.
Yeah.
Probably because you're going from 32 to 64-bit anyway.
Yeah.
With the 64-bit requirement, not a lot of 64-bit farms percentage-wise, I found in the 2007 world.
Yes. Yes.
So that's got to be recompiled anyway, right?
Well,
Right.
so it's interesting.
In a lot of cases.
And I'm going to talk about this in my session
Okay.
tomorrow. But in my experience, some things move over, right? So you always, one of the keys too, I think that was missing at RTM, the guidance-wise, was you want your developers, from IT pros, certainly I think you get the picture now, you always want your developers to package their code in a solution package, right? So that you can control it. You can add it, install it, activate it, upgrade it, deploy it, right? And that was kind of missing at RTM. We didn't have that guidance. The help files actually changed over time, what they recommended, right? And with 2010, at least they had that basis to start from, right?
Okay.
Always everything in a solution
Everything in a solution. Your IT pros will love you for that.
Yes, but it also makes your development experience much easier too, because you deploy it as a solution package on your dev environment, take that solution package, deploy it on the test environment, right? They can test with the same code, and you don't end up with as many mistakes.
Same deployable,
right?
same script, same everything.
Absolutely.
And then you can hand it off for the production guys to put out in the next maintenance window.
So that's a key too. I think that's an update to the 2007 guidance that works for 2010 as well.
Awesome.
But anyway, I found some of those WSPs that you've deployed to 2007, actually a lot of them, even if they have assemblies in them, but some of them don't have assemblies, they're just file system.
Yes.
You can apply those to a new 2010 farm,
Right.
and they'll work, right? Especially in 2007 mode, right? Because you've got that
That's
visual
right,
upgrade mode.
you don't do the visual upgrades. Do a DB attach and don't do the...
One of the other things I found, though, in my experience, is that visual upgrade mode is really intended to be temporary, right? So there's a number of things that don't quite work in the 2007 mode. So it's a great way to get a farm moved over quickly.
Yes.
But you want your end goal should be getting to visual upgrade to 2010
the full 2010,
as quick as
not the Frankensight, as I've heard it referred to.
Right. But the nice thing is that you can have that continuity where you have some things running in 2007 mode and you have some things running in 2010 mode, and it does actually give you a great jump start into 2010.
And you can delineate the roles of, okay, IT pro guys, get me into the new footprint. Okay, dev and design guys, let's get everything else cleaned up. But make sure you've got line of sight to what that looks like.
So some of the WSPs that aren't assemblies, that aren't compiled code, work, just especially in 2007 mode. But some of the assemblies work too. Web parts, if you compile them in Visual Studio 2008 and your 2007 farm for any CPU, is one of the options, right? If you specifically compiled it for x86, they won't work. Right, because all 2010 farms have to be 64-bit, and a lot of 2007 farms weren't, right? So there is a chance that those assemblies, if they were compiled for x86, they won't work. But some of them just work, right?
Awesome. All right, so this is going to get posted too late for you to go to Tom's session, but any chance to get to see Tom is always a good thing if you can find him at a conference or at a SharePoint event. But how can people find you in the interim? Where are you online?
Well, Jeff knows you can find me on Twitter. I'm Reesing, R-E-S-I-N-G, on Twitter. And I've got tomreesing.com where I've been blogging.
Tomreesing.com.
So my first and last name.
And there it is.
Right.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jeff.